Today's episode of What's the Big Idea is brought to you by Earth Radio, and now a human podcast.
To say then, oh, what's my kid's experience in school going to look like? And kind of thinking about how I want to influence systems and structures to humanize that, so she doesn't feel like she's not a math person, or that she feels frustrated by homework, or she feels, dehumanized by some of those same things. But also, I think the biggest impact has been my view of my students, right? That they're not just a pain in the butt, or they're not, whatever, but that they're someone's kid, and that they're a son or a daughter.
Thanks for checking out What's the Big Idea. I'm your host, Dan Carney. You just heard a snippet of my chat with Nick Covington, a high school teacher and co-leader of a really, really cool grassroots progressive education organization. You'll hear that full interview in a couple of minutes. Education is one of the most human things imaginable. It crosses time, place, and culture. It involves mind, body, and emotions. It's collaborative, it's social, reflective. It's about relationships, growth, and identity. Unfortunately, education has come under the watchful gaze of quantification in recent decades. Our modern age is largely defined by quantification, by statistics, and using data to tell the human story. And this is largely a good thing. But for many educators, quantification means cynical, shallow accountability. Nothing wrong with accountability, but too many top-down attempts, such as No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top, have been overly data-driven. Standardized test scores create cultures in schools that have many people wondering where the students fit in. But this episode is about grassroots, human-based learning, and I've recently discovered an organization I want you to know about. It's called the Human Restoration Project. And if you're a teacher, administrator, or parent who feels like data, test scores, grades, time on task has taken far too prominent a role in schools, the Human Restoration Project is a welcome antidote. Created and led by a teacher from Ohio and a teacher from Iowa, the project features resources, writing, podcasts, and soon, teacher micro-credentialing, all in the name of bringing a human-centered approach to the classroom. What impresses me most is the depth of thought and planning put into these resources. They are there to help teachers thrive in ways that can't easily be captured on a district by-the-numbers snapshot. So next up is my interview with one of those two creators, Nick Covington. We talk about teaching, the project, going gradeless, fatherhood, and in our conversation you'll hear just how thorough and thoughtful he is. I'll be posting many of my favorite resources from the Human Restoration Project on Twitter at BigIdeaEd. Enjoy this interview. Back in 10 seconds. All right, I'm excited now to be joined on the podcast by Nick Covington. Nick is a high school social studies teacher in Iowa, and he's the co-leader of the Human Restoration Project, a nonprofit organization aimed at transforming school systems and just one of the great grassroots ed efforts that you'll find out there. Nick's also a fantastic presence on Twitter at Covington AHS. Nick, thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for the invite, Dan.
A lot I want to get to, particularly your project, the Human Restoration Project, which is full of so many great resources and thoughts. But I thought we could start with you as a teacher, why you got into teaching. And last fall, you wrote in the Restore Humanity magazine that your organization puts out. You wrote about a turning point for you as a young teacher when you came upon Alfie Kohn's "The Schools Our Children Deserve."
Yeah.
Could you talk a bit about that experience, how that changed your view, and what does it mean to teach to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's an interesting one, isn't it? So that book kind of hit me at a point in my career where I was really concerned about about me lasting in the profession, to be honest with you, because it seemed like the things that I had tried for the last, gosh, when was that? That was probably 2017, 2018. So about 4 or 5 years into the profession. It seemed like the things that I was trying to do just weren't working at all. And so having to iterate constantly, having to change things constantly. And when I hit that book, it seemed to describe for me all of the things that I had felt, but I didn't really have a language to describe. There was nothing that I was able to connect to why things weren't working. And it also hit me at a time as a parent, and parenthood really changed my ideas about education too. As I started to see my daughter then kind of growing up, she's 5 now, so she would have just been a couple of years old then, learning language, right, learning how to walk, even things like potty training. And so the things that I was reading in Cone, and he's touched on parenting too in his other works. And the things that I saw with my students in the classroom, like Cone for me was kind of that bridge to help describe what I was feeling, but then also give it like a research base to say, well, here's why what you're feeling actually is right about what we do wrong in education. So yeah.
And when you talk about those early struggles, not as maybe struggles, but the frustrations you had early in your career, what were some specific things that were giving you the most frustration?
Yeah, for sure. So like I pretty early on, and even in my student teaching, like gravitated towards what I didn't really know then was more like a constructivist approach, like getting kids to have some experiences and reflect on those things, right? And so when I got my first full-time teaching position, it was really sort of the opposite of that, right? Really PLC driven, common formative assessment driven, common summative final assessment driven, and I was ready to break out of that model because I didn't find that what I was doing with my kids in the classroom really translated into those common summative assessments that I felt were geared more towards a direct instruction approach. And so I transitioned my final assessment. I asked if I could just pilot an approach for among my colleagues and try to do a portfolio assessment in world history for our sophomores. And when I did that, it was really going out on a leap because it involved, instead of spending that final 90-minute time frame, instead of spending that time frame with the kids taking a big long test, right, and then scoring it up and seeing how kids did, it was that evidence gathering conversation. It was reflecting on their progress and just ending with a final conversation with kids. And I think I started those, about 5 years ago in world history, and then I haven't really broken from that model. But one thing that I saw in those conversations was that kids did not have a language to describe their experience of learning. They just filtered everything through the language of points and through the language of grades. So we'd sit there with this wonderful artifact, right? They'd created a slide on a shared Google slide that looked at an issue in modern nationalism. So they'd look at Catalonian independence as a nationalist issue, describe, kind of break it down for us and analyze it. And I'd say, okay, so what did you learn about Catalonian independence? And they'd say, well, I don't really know, but I know I got an A on it. And I said, well, if you got an A, you must have done something right. And they go, well, I don't know, but I got an A. And so that was one thing that was really frustrating for me, was to say that those kids the ones that I felt like were doing really well had no idea what they were doing that was good, or why they were learning, or what they were learning about why that was important. And so I thought, okay, so I have to use a different language to describe things. But also I thought in the world history class especially that it was really tough because I was working with a co-teacher then. It was really tough to keep kids engaged in topics that they didn't care about. And they didn't care about learning about I've written about this, like the Reformation for 3 weeks, right? And the differences between John Calvin and Martin Luther and all the rest. And so, it just becomes mind-numbing after a time for those kids to sit there and act like they have to care about the things that I cared about, or that the things were in the curriculum. And there was no space for them to assert themselves. And so I wasn't really able to do it with my sophomores so much before I dropped that class and picked up some other things. But when I picked up some senior level econ classes, I knew that I had to make some kind of space for them to make the transition then from from school to like the rest of their lives, and
Yeah.
start to look at things more through like a really solid PBL lens. So those were some of the things, right? Kids weren't really connecting with learning in ways that were meaningful. They couldn't describe their experiences in
Mhm.
ways that didn't involve points and grades, and just a low level of engagement in my classes where, hey, I think I'm an engaging guy. So what am I doing wrong? You know?
Kids get hung up on grades, and teachers so often get hung up on content,
Right.
and it ideas seem to get lost in the fold. The last year, I had a couple of great interviews with Julie Stern and Trevor Alio about
Yes.
concept-based teaching and learning, and how you what a great portal that is to getting kids to think about big ideas and entering the curriculum through that lens, and how you can really get students thinking about things in ways that actually interest them and actually engage them. And I imagine you probably have a lot of that in your classroom now, or idea. It's more idea driven than simply content driven.
Absolutely. And that's even in the I taught world history probably for like the first 3 or 4, 5 years. It's like blurring now, but that was it. That was the first thing, was to move more towards those things. So the nationalism assignment I was just talking to you about. So we didn't just learn about, God, I don't know, Otto von Bismarck and German reunification and things, because for a lot of kids, that's just not important. That's just not important content. Like the important part of that is to look at, I don't know, causes and effects or consequences. And then what we would do is then we'd take, okay, let's use that as a lens to look at issues in modern nationalism, explore where's that a hotbed today. So then spending some time really just breaking down, what are some of the issues in modern nationalism? What similarities and commonalities do they have? What are the consequences of those kinds of things? Where does power play a role in those? So yeah, absolutely elevating it to the conceptual level for transferability. And you mentioned Trevor Aleo, and he's one of my inspirations on Twitter. So just to
Yeah,
pay
that's
that pay
great.
that forward a little bit, because I love when he posts. His students have those designs, and he
Yeah,
always has those
yeah.
wonderful like conceptual transfer flow charts for kids. And I think that's such like a powerful tool to, like to reinforce transfer as like a skill that we have to practice. And that, yeah, it's going to require some content, but at the same time, memorizing the content isn't the end goal. It's to get us to think about the things that are affecting us in the present.
And I guess I would think a unit or a study on of nationalism would also impact the way students, they see the world, they see their own place in the world. You
Yes.
were
Yeah.
you were writing recently about a book by Brooks and Brooks. It's the case for constructivist classrooms.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, and I think you were sort of paraphrasing their definition, but you said that deep understanding is when students have demonstrated a change in their behavior as a result of a change in their thinking.
Yeah.
I thought that is such a spot on definition. I think as teachers, that's what we should be striving for, that students are internalizing the learning to a point where they understand that they have an impact on the world. How they change their thinking and their behavior actually is part of the bigger society we live in.
Yeah, absolutely. And to kind of go off of that, because I've been so steeped in Geert Biesta's stuff the last few
Mm.
weeks, and he's like a John Dewey scholar. So all of his stuff is like really deep, like Dewey epistemology stuff, which kind of can get a little bit like a cult almost, because it's so obscure. But he writes just so, or at least the way that he packages Dewey's theory of knowing, that like the learning part of is not separate from our being in the world. And it doesn't happen in some place separate from it doesn't happen separate from us. Like the knowing and learning is just part of our daily interactions with everything. So we're constantly learning, right? And it's about that deep understanding, just comes from our interactions with our environment, and constantly pushing and prodding and pulling, and that daily experimentation. And that just changes our role as a teacher, I think, to one of, well, how can we make those processes more explicit so that way we can help kids dig a little bit deeper? Or I like to use the analogy of lenses with kids. So we're going to look at this with a particular lens, or let's develop this lens or this set of questions about looking at problems, and then we'll apply that lens to 4 or 5 different issues under that concept, and kind of see, another big conceptual thing might be imperialism, in a history context. So let's develop a lens of imperialism, and then apply the concept to 4 or 5 places that it's happened in the past and the present, and draw connections between those. So yeah, that's I think the role of the instructor is just to help make those things, those things that kids are already doing more explicit, so that way we can help them do it when they're not in a structured environment. Like let's help them develop those habits of curiosity and questioning, that are going to sustain them far longer than knowing the date of German unification or something, right? Or why that's important.
Yeah,
So
no, totally. There was, I think it was yesterday or the day before, someone tweeted something about, hey, what are your students going to be doing if they're home because your school closed because of the coronavirus?
yeah,
I think it was Dintersmith, right? The guy that did this big book about school reform, and
yeah,
that's just it, right? Are we empowering kids to feel like, hey, when I'm at school, the learning doesn't stop. There's things I'm interested in. There's things I can do. I want to take on that learning myself, and that's exactly what you've described. But so often schools, and it feels more like training than learning, right? And that's the thing with these tests. It doesn't matter what subject it's in. So often the test looks more like you're training how to take the test more than you're doing any kind of learning around what's inside that test.
yeah.
And I don't know how you feel about that, but you sort of, students are trained to chase the grade. Teachers are trained to deliver content,
Yeah.
and learning kind of gets lost in the middle.
Yeah. So I think one thing that has kind of empowered my transition more to speak back to some of the senior level work that I've been doing with kids in econ. I mentioned trying to prepare them more for the transition outside of school, kind of recognizing that this is really just a capstone year for them. And it really was just disturbing to me the more I taught seniors and shifted from 10th graders to 12th graders, was to think of how much their classroom experience still looks identical to the last 10 years of their life.
Yeah.
They study, they do worksheets. I had a kid taking an astronomy class, working on a vocabulary word find in class the other day for astronomy. That was, some homework grade for points. We just kids buried under massive amounts of worksheets and all of these structures that as soon as May 20th rolls around, whenever commencement is, they might not ever be in that environment again.
Right.
And so it's like, how do we prepare them and really scaffold them to be not in a place that values content, but values that way of thinking? So what I've tried to look at then is not assessment of learning, like those summative, right? We make such a big deal of the summative, and kids have adopted that language too, but to move to a model where it's like assessment as learning. So I really try to talk with my seniors at the beginning of the year to onboard them into like my ungraded process about, well, how do you know when you've learned something new? So that's been the big takeaway of my lesson is kids don't know. So we have to train them in that same language that we would train them normally in content, is we have to help them build that lens back up that they had when they were 5 years old and asking why 1,000 times like my daughter does. But get them to be thinking about those things. So when we ask them, how do you know when you've learned something new? And they'll say, well, I can talk about it. I can show you. I can demonstrate it. I can teach it to someone else. And then I'll ask them, well, how often do you get the chance to do that? Like, and have that count as learning.
Yeah.
If you can talk to me about the factors of production, or how you're thinking about your spending habits has changed in the first 6 weeks of economics, let's count that as assessment, because that's what learning in the adult world looks like. I know I've learned something new when I get excited about it and I want to share it on Twitter with my friends, or you talk about it at brunch with your family. That's when like those learning things happen. So to adopt that Dewey approach of, well, our learning is constant, and that theory of learning happens when we're playing with those ideas in an experimental way. Well, if we never stop talking about ideas and we never stop doing things with them, we're learning all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So bringing that model into my classroom, and I've turned every single summative assessment into a conversation. So it's an evidence-based conversation. In their evidence journals, we talk about some big takeaways for them, how they felt about the learning, and if they didn't feel great about it, what were some hangups for them? What were things that they didn't feel great about? And then just sit in that stimulative conversation. I can poke and prod and I can push them on there, but really it's collaborative too. So yeah, I think it's moving away from like assessment as being the ends of the learning to, right, a continuation of the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so often in life, the lens through which we see things is determined by how we've defined the end result. Right? And grades is a great example. As a society, we have decided and accepted that the end of student learning is a grade.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned ungrading, So what does ungrading look like in your classroom?
Yeah. So let's see. The old model that Mr. Covington used to operate under was very traditional, right? Because I tried to fit into what the system supported, and I guess I should say that like anywhere where I'm at now is just the result of me thinking that I had made it in the previous few years,
Yeah.
and then trying to do everything right, and then realizing that it was not getting the job done. And I found that the more that I transgressed, like the more that I did teaching that looked not like good teaching, I felt like the better teacher I was. And then with the experiences that I have, and with like the years that I have in my building and the leadership opportunities I've had, like I kind of sit on like a perch of privilege, to speak in a lot of ways, and so I'm able to do things and push boundaries in ways that teachers can't, like in their first year coming in, that I wouldn't have been able to. So what that looks like is I have stopped using our online grading program. I don't put points. I don't put anything in there. I don't use it,
And,
because
what do parents, when you first did that, because I think the online grading portal, we're all familiar with that, the
yeah.
tyranny of that thing. What was the reaction when you first started doing that?
It honestly, it was a little bit of confusion because I hadn't set up enough supports in the classroom to kind of um, be able to report things to parents and admin and even to kids too, to like figure out where they're at in that process. Because I think in the conversion from a grades driven classroom to like a
Yeah.
feedback driven one, I hadn't quite, like, I didn't have the transitional fossil like between those to
Yeah.
get there.
Sure.
So it was messy, but like my heart was in the right place.
Okay.
So
Got it.
whereas beforehand it was like, well, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, but then I learned that about all the harms and everything of grades, and then my frustration with the grading portal. So then as I made the jump, like I made the transition without necessarily having constructed the landing pad, but then now I'm in a place where I think I can apply the model that I have to any class that I'm teaching and find some success because I've been successful with it. So it was confusion, but I think the quality of learning increased regardless. Does that make sense? So like
Absolutely.
I saw positive outcomes, even if it looked a little bit different. And it meant too that rather than have parents get the information about their child's academic progress through Infinite Campus, I was having to be more purposeful in making those just like it's a conversation with kids, it had to be more of a conversation with adults. And it was a little bit time consuming. But now I'm in a place where, yeah, I don't use Infinite Campus as a place to report points and grades and have to listen to kids say, oh, I was at an A and then you put in this thing as missing and now I'm at a C plus and it
Yeah.
just crashes your whole day, right? Or I don't have to hear any more about when I would go and enter grades in at 4 a.m. when I would be up. Kids, when I'd get to school, give me a bunch of grief about, hey, Covington up early this morning, and I'd be like, yeah, well, how did you know? Because they were getting notifications on their phone, on their headboard, and it was waking them up, or having their parents text them in the middle of class because they got a poor grade on a Spanish assignment and now they're mad at their mom in my class, right? So it's like, let's just throw all those things out the window and build a new path. So I abandoned that and built the evidence journal, which is where everything gets housed there. And I'm telling you, I'm not going back to anything else. I've adopted that in AP Euro as well. So we build a portfolio throughout the semester that meets all those different criteria. We have a conversation based around that evidence to assign a grade when we need to. But other than that, short of where I absolutely am required by the board policies to input grades, I don't use Infinite Campus at all. And kids still learn. It's amazing. Like all of the critiques to say kids don't do anything, do blah blah blah.
Bro.
No, it's amazing. It actually frees up kids who like already are intrinsically motivated. And if you say, hey, you can just achieve at whatever level, I'm just going to kind of help scaffold you along the way. But if you don't need those things, you can go ahead and work ahead. I have kids who are done with aspects of my class already. Well, guess what? That frees me up to help the kids who actually need a lot of one-on-one teacher support. And there are some kids first semester that I worked one-on-one with almost every single day, because it freed me up so other kids could work independently or work together to kind of meet those other goals. And I would just be partnering with one student during the whole class period. So it really has changed the perspective, and I'm in a really like a happier, healthier, place with kids and culture as a result of it.
Yeah, the idea that kids won't learn without grades is ridiculous. One of your tips on your site for ungrading is just give everyone an A. and go from
Yeah.
there. I did that once. I for a unit, one of the units, I just said to the kids at the beginning, like, you're all getting an A. And in fact, we're going to be looking at these domain specific outcomes, 21st century skill types. And I definitely had a what have I just done kind of moment, because I could imagine parents. And you know what? Actually, it went great, and nobody ever asked me
Yes.
about it, and the students were really into it. And so, yeah, I agree. No,
Yeah.
the
Well, the thing about that is if parents ever had questions and they asked me, I had all the receipts. You have a portfolio of all the kids' work that you probably understand more than somebody who just put points in a grade. I mean, so a parent sees an assignment goes in at a 8.5 out of 10. Well, they don't know what that means. They don't know what kids learned. But if they have questions and they ask me, well, then it's like, oh, here's all the stuff. Here's your child's reflections in their own words. So
yeah,
at parent-teacher conferences, I just have those portfolios, and it's just like, here's where your kid's at. Here's a pathway. They're either they're in progress towards their need to be. They've met the goal, or they haven't. Here's exactly what they need to do to get there. And every parent that I've had conferences with, like, say that it's a good model.
yeah,
It's a great model for understanding their kid.
awesome.
Yeah,
And you mentioned the evidence journal, which is
yeah,
one of the many incredible resources found at the Human Restoration Project site. So maybe now would be a good time to transition to that.
sure.
Um, where did this idea come from? Because it really is. I only discovered this recently and was pretty much blown away by both its breadth and its depth, and all the thinking that you and your colleagues have put into the resources and the magazine and the podcast. How did this project start?
So it started, I think, Chris McNutt and Michael Hyde, two Ohio educators. Chris McNutt's obviously with he's the executive director today, but he and Michael Hyde started it, I think, back in like December, late 2017. Got it going up on Twitter, and I connected with Chris then probably that spring of 2018, and I honestly thought it was a huge organization, because he was putting together this restore package, and he was like, hey, we'll send this free restore pack to anyone who sends us a DM. And I DM'd him being like, this sounds really cool. Because I was reading Alfie Kohn at the time. I was kind of dipping a toe into like all those progressive ideas. So I got that. I dove deep into it, and then kind of just built up, the little circle on Twitter that's still kind of my core people on there today,
Yeah.
and just kept talking to Chris. And then I wrote an article in August 2018 about that was all about those experiences in ungrading, and kind of building a lens and moving towards PBL stuff. And then Chris contacted me to be like, hey, do you want to publish that on our Medium page for HRP? And I was like, I would love to.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until the next summer that and Chris and I have talked. I probably talked to Chris. I talked to my wife and then Chris, like in that order. Like we talk every hour of every day, pretty much, on Twitter. But then it was in the spring of just last year, late spring, early summer, June 2019, perhaps, that he was like, "Hey, do you want to partner on this? You want to go all in?" Because I think it was a one-man operation for a while. I think
Mhm.
Michael moved into an admin position and just couldn't do stuff anymore. And so Chris and I spent that summer just pumping out content and holding conferences and really just kind of figuring out the direction we want to go. And it's kind of led to this now, having two podcasts, putting out the magazines, churning out
Yeah.
content. We're working right now. Our 501c3 application with the IRS is like processing. So we're hoping to have that by summer. So that way we can roll out a micro-credentialing program to actually help, onboard teachers who are interested in progressive ed. So we can partner with teacher training programs. We can partner with progressive colleges or, progressive schools who want to onboard new teachers to their processes too. But yeah, that's kind of the next step for us, is just building in, like, modeling what does human-centered professional development look like for teachers, and not just bringing those ideas for students in our classrooms.
Yeah, you have something called the primer,
Yeah.
which is fantastic, right?
That's
So,
that's that's
and
Chris's baby. I want to just glow up Chris as much as I can here, because he it the synthesis of his abilities and ideas is really awesome.
Yeah.
And I feed off his energy all the time. Like he comes up with an idea like, hey, I want to do this primer, and then he'll just start sending drafts over, and it's like, okay, let's add this, and then he'll just build the whole thing, and it looks like it took a team of graphic designers and
Oh,
authors and everything else, but it's mostly Chris designing those digital resources. Yeah.
yeah, it's incredible. The graphics are worth checking out. It reminds me of that old German movie Metropolis.
Yes.
That, right?
Yeah.
It has
And
that.
that's old sci-fi aesthetic is just so
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, it's cool. But anyway, so this primer, I'm going to be putting this on Twitter and just recommending to anybody. This should be sitting in any progressive educator's classroom for
Sure.
reference. It's great. And one of the things about it that I really had me thinking was you have this table that basically compares progressive education with neoliberal education.
Right.
And that really got my attention because there's a lot of things under the neoliberal category that I think a lot of teachers, with all the best intentions, are doing, and feeling like that they are pushing the envelope, they are progressive. And this really got me thinking. For an example would be setting aside an hour each week to support student interests, right? The
Hmm.
old genius hour, right? Which I
Yes.
love that idea. You see that all over.
Oh
And
yeah.
and what you say here is actually the truly progressive version of that idea is redoing the schedule to place the student interest at the forefront.
Yeah.
And again, this goes back to that idea that I brought up earlier that we have these we've defined the end result of so many things, and it limits our thinking. And I think
Yeah.
truly creative thinking is when you can ignore our definition of the end result and you can come up with new solutions. Yeah, it's really remarkable. And then you have the magazine as well, which I love. I love just the idea of like a physical thing, and I think I'm just gonna like print it and like stick it in all my teachers' colleagues' boxes and just like,
Yes.
hey, just read this and we'll start a conversation. But
Yeah.
it must take so much time for you because your fingerprints are all over this, man. You got your articles and the podcast. It's a major labor of love.
Yeah, definitely. And again, it's something that again, Chris and we're talking all the time. We're bouncing ideas back and forth. Right now, even just today, we were working on our plan for our micro credentials for us, our syllabus for our college class that we want to run. And it just is. But the thing is too, like these are all things that I was doing and reading and talking about before HRP,
Right.
just because it's a passion and an interest. And so HRP just gives a structure and an outlet, and like honestly, like a really supportive community for those ideas to land in. And that just makes me want to, I don't want to disappoint those people. so,
Yeah.
so, so the people who read my articles and share it, and it gets shared, in circles that I never would have it land in, or, some prestigious people, retweet it or something like that kind of intrinsic thing is just super cool. And again, like I got to do something, man. It's just energy that I would just channel into something else if I wasn't doing this.
Right.
So it's yeah, it takes a lot of time, but I don't think of it as being like difficult work. It's just I think Chris is a wonderful partner in this. I don't think I don't know if we could have two better people to work together on it. I don't know. Like we have really good chemistry, I think, and he's just we've never met in person in 2 years. He
Wow.
lives in Ohio. I live in Iowa. But we FaceTime all the time. We were constantly on the Twitter chat, and somehow we make it work. I don't know.
Wow. And you talk about community,
Yeah.
and how maybe you could explain a bit more why that's so important in this process, because I feel like teachers, to a large extent, have grown pretty cynical of top-down educational directives. We've lived through a couple of decades now of some pretty flawed or failed top-down initiatives, but this is the opposite. This is truly grassroots. And how has your community responded to this work? What do you see coming out of teachers as a result of this project?
Yeah, I think what has been so cool is that there are people all the time who kind of had the same revelation that I did at a certain point, that teaching doesn't have to be one particular way, that it doesn't have to be answering Marzano's PLC questions. It doesn't have to be this narrow definition of standards-based grading, which probably is one of those neoliberal reforms that you were referencing earlier. It doesn't have to be this particular way. And once I realized that, like that was a revelation for me to have to go explore a whole world of critical pedagogy, right? And a whole world of teachers going gradeless. And it just connects you to a whole bunch of other communities that you didn't know existed, but that are different, entirely different models of education, right?
Yeah.
Independent schools, self-directed education, even, homeschooling, right, has a different perspective on those things. And coming from a public school context, all I've been is a public school teacher. I think all Chris has been is a public school teacher. So not supporting teachers isn't that's not an option for us. So we want to model as much as possible the kind of changes that we would want for kids, for teachers too, because nobody likes an hour of sit and get. Nobody likes to be told that they know better about our students than they do. Just like kids don't like to be told what they want to learn or how they're going to learn it all the time. So we want to model for teachers like a critical lens and get them thinking and reflecting and gathering their own data about what they value in the classroom and how what they're teaching aligns with that, or how assessment lines up with that. And start to have a reflective conference model for teachers too. And I think too, it comes down to the fact that a lot of those top-down policies that you're talking about are designed to pit teachers against each other. So they're designed to rank and sort teachers, right? Figure out who the best teacher is, give them incentive pay, value-added models of learning that are supported by, the Zuckerberg Chan Foundation and supported by big money organizations that we talk to all the time. In fact, Chris and I were set up to maybe have an interview with one of the bigger education organizations until we found out on their website that up to a certain point, probably where it was less politically popular, they were pushing a lot of anti-teacher union stuff. And so that's not something that we can stand for if we also think that, teachers are members of a community and their voice needs to be valued and their organizations and decisions matter too. So there's just not a way that we can participate in the structures that tear down teachers, just like we can't participate in the structures that we think tear down students.
And community is important to teachers, and one of the new spots for community is online, is social media, Twitter, and a lot of teachers are discovering, and I've discovered that there's a real opportunity for community there. But they also run into some rather aggressive points of view on Twitter.
I think I know where you're going with this.
Yeah. Your most recent episode of your podcast, Reteaching, is called Why What Works Won't Work and Why What Works May Hurt. And it's a really excellent rebuttal to what we might call the evidence-based movement, although I think movement probably gives it too much credence. Can you just explain, if for a listener that might not be totally familiar, when we say that, we describe the sort of evidence-based movement, what are we talking about?
Yeah. This is the newest Alfie Kohn thing. This is discovering that the schools our children deserve for the first time, right? So I'm diving all into this. But the evidence-based movement, right, especially on Twitter, is one that almost has this fundamentalist, reductionist view of teaching as memory transfer. So the better teachers are the ones that can best facilitate the transfer from short-term into long-term memory. And the best way to assess that are, the ways of the clinical laboratory, because that's what medical practice is modeled after. That's what, that's how we understand the empirical world of objective facts is, through random controlled trials and experimentation. Well, you run into some issues there because teaching and learning isn't necessarily that what Biesta calls that closed deterministic system, right? It's harder to appeal to cause and effect when there's so many variables at stake. You don't know if a kid did poorly because they didn't sleep last night, or because they didn't have anything to eat for lunch, or their parents had an argument and they're not thinking about things, or insert any number of variables, not to mention anxiety, depression, ADHD, ADHD or any other, they don't have glasses. I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But then to say that you can measure the inputs and outputs of education and figure out what kids are learning, I don't know. I'm kind of skeptical of the basic methodologies of that.
Yeah, there's a huge library of research on education out there. It's enormous. How did it come that this one subset of the education world has so vehemently asserted that the research says this one thing? And it really does come to this one thing. There's this really narrow focus, and if you're not right in that narrow focus, you're wrong. Basically, tends to be the perspective.
And to a certain extent, I think I have appreciated at least being part of some of those conversations online, to the extent that they really force me to challenge my own beliefs on those things.
Yep.
But at the same time, I've become really exhausted with the perspective that what I'm doing with project-based learning is somehow a myth or a fad or it's malpractice because it doesn't fit into that narrow window. So I think, and like I said in the article and in the podcast too, that the point is not to throw evidence-based practice out the window, but find when it's appropriate to use with your kids in the classroom. It doesn't mean we throw professional judgment out the window because Daniel Willingham says that retrieval practice is the only thing that schools should be about. Retrieval practice is a tool. It's not the ends itself, right? So bring it into your classroom when you feel like that's a need for kids. But to the exclusion of all the other possible ways of knowing and doing learning and schooling just doesn't fit in with my experience with children. It doesn't fit in with my experience in the world. It doesn't fit into any of those models. And to me, I really think it comes down to, and this is what I kind of landed on in the last 48 hours of conclusions about this. And then I'm just about ready to be done. But at a certain point, it just comes down to control, because what you see a lot of these systems doing, especially in UK circles and maybe to some extent in Australian circles too, is that they already have systems that are built around these behaviorist controls, right? Very rigid control of student behaviors, desks sitting in rows. You see this a little bit with Teach Like a Champion too, which I've kind of gotten on a little kick about there recently, but those things already existed before they had any cognitive science basis to justify it. So it almost seems like they're working backwards from, oh, hey, this is the way that we want kids. This is our preferred method for kids to act. And so we're going to go find the cognitive science basis for that supports that as a learning outcome. Despite anything else that might exist in the world, it's to justify our, maybe I'll say conservative view of the way that kids should be, the way that they should exist. And so we're going to go find the science to support that.
Right. All right. I don't want to spend too long on that because it's it could go there for a while.
Yes, it could.
What is the Human Restoration Project School? Nick Covington gets to design the Human Restoration Project School. What does it look like?
Oh man, that's a great question. I would love to see a model that looks a lot like, what's the documentary Most Likely to Succeed that's got the High Tech High projects in there. I love that model of learning. And that movie deals a lot too with those kids who couldn't land the plane, doesn't it? Because there's kids who work their butt off up to the last minute. They're just over ambitious, they want to overachieve, don't get it done in that window, but still are. They transfer that intrinsic motivation into completing that project to their perfectionism. So I don't know. I imagine a structure that works to highlight those things. So a structure that can help students with community-based, project-based learning, and all of the prerequisites that come with that. It's ungraded, so that takes that out of the question. It builds soft skills, it builds community connections, all of those things. I mean, my gosh, like there's no need to reinvent the wheel with those kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
Like we have those good models of what things look like. Now, I will say, so my school a couple of years ago started this new program called Orbis. And what it is it's literally that kind of environment, but kids on like kind of a smaller level where for a handful of kids, maybe 30, 60 kids rotate around a semester. They spend a half a day in an alternative kind of campus in which it's more they get projects from community businesses or through the legislature, and they work on building those relationships or tools for them, or they intern for the Iowa Secretary of State's office, or they do some things like that for kind of job-based things. It's not necessarily pure open PBL and like let's get a whole bunch of high-tech high kids in a room and kind of give them a big challenging task for the semester, but it kind of helps in that transition to that model. So I would love to be in a place that just valued that more often. If I could cut out teaching content, I totally would, and just focus on that other kind of model.
Yeah, and you'd have the mastery transcript in there probably.
Yes, I would love to, or just build our own. If we really
sure.
had that. Use the mastery transcript as a model to avoid paying the consortium fee, but maybe just partner with kids and we would talk about what should we do and how should we do that. I do have a ton of I hate the fact that so much of what happens to kids that I have that are 17 and 18, some are turning 19 years old, and they sit at desks for 8 hours, inside a classroom, like I said earlier, in the same way that they did when they were in 5th grade, same way as they were in 9th grade, same way. And it's just like, oh my God, what are we preparing them for other than just sitting in a desk inside a classroom the whole time? And I want to go out. I want to have the classroom be like a voluntary place where we come like 10% of the time to kind of check in and organize, and then break out into the rest of their lives, and go out and do cool stuff. Skylar Prim up at Highmark, they do like their field days. I don't know if you follow Skylar at all. He's one of our board members, but it's a really inspiring model. They get kids outside in natural settings and doing exploratory work out there. Focusing on SDGs. I'd love to do like a whole class just about SDGs and get kids doing that. I mean, literally, when you pull the ceiling and the walls off of school, the possibilities are endless. So it sucks that we have all of these limitations and criteria that we have to meet. And the ironic part is a lot of kids spend 12 years in school and don't even end up meeting those expectations. So they don't do the things that they might want to do in the meantime, and they don't get the experience that might be valuable for them later on, and they don't even build the quote unquote basic skills. So they could pass their Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader trivia game. So,
that's sitting through 8 hours a day is a funny one. I mean, you've been through many staff meetings, I'm sure. I mean, most teachers can't make it through a 45-minute staff meeting. But
we're the worst.
Yeah,
we're the absolute worst.
And kids are, the bell rings, and they move to the next room, and they sit there for another 40 to 60 minutes or whatever. No, it's farcical at times when you think about how we constructed it. Well, look, I really want to thank you for joining me today. One last question at the beginning of our talk, you referenced how fatherhood changed you and changed your perspective. What does learning look like at the Covington household? What is your daughter shown you about learning as she's hanging out?
I love being outside with her. We love, just as a family, going on walks. And one of the the privileges of being a teacher is spending that summertime with your kids too. And now that I've got 2 kids, my attention's a little bit more torn. But it was so special to be able to spend those summer days with her, and just really wake up in the morning and she would say walk, and we'd just go on a walk, and we'd be at the park, and we kind of live at a place that has like a creek nearby, and there'd be like a turtle under the playground one day, and we just spend however much time we need like talking about the turtle and talking about respecting nature and talking about what the turtle's trying to do, and and those kinds of things. I remember one time too, we went to a different playground and she was watching the ants and we had like snacks in her snack bag. So I pulled out like a graham cracker, crumbled it up next to the ant hill. And I've got this wonderful picture of her, just sitting watching the ants. And she'll still talk about that. She was like 2 years old and she'll be like, Dad, do you remember that one time when we watched the ants? Or she loves, she'll catch frogs, she'll catch snakes. So her, just seeing her, like the look on her face and like hearing her talk about those experiences, that were like one-time things that for me was just like, it might have been part of an exhausting day, but for her, it was like the whole world was just encapsulated in that. Dad, do you remember that moment when we caught a frog at the playground?
Yeah.
And it's just like, I do, honey. And that was so cool that to be able to do that. And she'll remember the frog's name and she'll remember like what we did. And got just being out with her when we did like a Thanksgiving thing too. And for her daycare, I was like, what do you like to do? And this last summer too, I got a bike so that way I could ride a bike with her because she was starting to get in that on her training wheels. And so being able to go on like the first bike ride with her and just living in that moment and that excitement with her. Yeah, I'm kind of like getting emotional thinking about it, because those are the things where it's like that was 30 minutes of like a hot summer day where probably we did a dozen different activities and I ended the day in a heap of sweat and tiredness. But like for those 30 minutes, it was like her and Dad riding bikes and those kinds of things are awesome. So we don't push activities. We kind of just let our kids do their thing, and they love looking at books. We love listening to music, dance. Dance is cool. I play guitar, so I've got instruments in the house too. We've got pianos and keyboards, and the kids just fiddle around on those things. Not in a whole lot of structure. But yeah, just love and support and feeding that natural curiosity. I don't know. You said, we could talk about the cognitive science part of this all day and then ended with a question about me being a dad. And I feel like that's the one where I could spend the whole day talking about that. So that's really where it was to say then, what's my kid's experience in school going to look like? And kind of thinking about how I want to influence systems and structures to humanize that so she doesn't feel like she's not a math person or that she feels frustrated by homework or she feels, dehumanized by some of those same things. But also, I think the biggest impact has been my view of my students, right? That they're not just a pain in the butt or they're not, whatever, but that they're someone's kid and that they're a son or a daughter, that they're a brother and a sister. And the way that I would treat them based on their grade or based on, how they're acting in class, like the way that they act in class is totally natural for the environment that they're in because it's a artificial environment. So just wanting to just chill and kind of reduce the impact of those artificial structures and treat kids as kids was really life-changing for me, man.
Nice. And to be fair, fatherhood's a lot more interesting than cognitive science anyway. So.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Nick, thanks so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk to you anytime, Dan, and we'll stay in touch, I'm sure.
Thanks to Nick Covington, and thanks to you for checking out this episode. HumanRestorationProject.org is where you'll find Nick and his partner, Chris McNutt. As always, I welcome comments and questions on Twitter @BigIdeaEd. Music today by Molo, courtesy of Tribe of Noise. Check us out next time.